Hello, my lovelies. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Jenna, your host. We are still in our folklore series, and today's episode is about werewolves. Now, I can remember in childhood thinking that werewolves might be real and that they typically would come out under a full moon, right? You always see images of like wolves howling at the moon, especially full moons, right? It's like something changes in them. And so we're going to cover what is a werewolf. So, werewolves in folklore originated in ancient times, with the earliest references found in the Epic of Gilgamesh in 2100 BC and Greek mythology, like the legend of the lichen. Have you guys seen the movie, I cannot remember off the top of my head, really pretty actress Kate Beckinsale? She is a vampire and she ends up basically becoming romantically involved with the head of the lichens. So there's this feud in the movie between werewolves and vampires, right? And so she's a vampire, but she falls in love with like the head of the lichens or the werewolves. And so it creates like this turmoil, and then they have offspring that is a hybrid of both, and yada yada down the line. So it's a super good movie. It's a series. I want to say there's at least 3 of them if I remember correctly. Anyways, they're good movies if you ever want to watch one. So the concept of shape-shifting was a widespread belief in antiquity, which later integrated with fears of wolves and witchcraft to evolve into the European werewolf myths that we know today. So I have a dog that is part wolf, very small percentage wolf, and he's part, we think, Belgian Malinois. So he definitely has some of the wolf characteristics, like at night when we're getting ready to go to sleep, he'll kind of hunch down and get this like creepy little look about him. And he's the sweetest dog in the world. He really absolutely loves to just come up and lick you and cuddle, and he's very vocal first thing in the morning when he wants food or to be outside or whatever, but he's really a sweetheart. But he can look quite intimidating, especially if he feels threatened. All of his hackles, his hair starts to stand up. The other day I had taken the dogs to the dog park, and there were a couple and 2 dogs that were leaving, and he let out the biggest, loudest bark I've heard him do in a very long time, growling and howling and posturing. And so I imagine if you were on the receiving end of that, especially late at night, that it would definitely be unsettling. So let's discuss ancient origins of the werewolf. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving Western prose, describes the goddess Ishtar turning a former lover into a wolf, a pivotal moment in the development of werewolf legends. Greek mythology. In the legend of Lycaon, Zeus transforms the king of Arcadia into a wolf as punishment for serving him human remains. Photo-Indo-European mythology. The concept of lycanthropy may stem from a Proto-Indo-European warrior traditions where young warriors in wolfskins formed a specific cult. Interesting, okay? The evolution of the myth. The Nuri, the Greek historian Herodotus, wrote of the Nuri, a tribe in Scythia who were said to transform into wolves for several days each year. Now, I can remember hearing a story, and I'm not positive of its origins, that Native American cultures would do something called like a spirit walk, where they had wolf skins. There were legends of shape-shifting going on. Also like spiritual journeys where they would, induce hallucinations through different means, peyote and ayahuasca, or ayahuasca, however you say that. Different psychedelics that were used in ceremonies basically to induce hallucinations so that they could kind of trip a little bit and see these otherworld entities. So that's another one that comes to mind with that. In Nordic folklore, the saga of the Volsungs features characters who use magical wolf pelts to transform into wolves for a killing spree. Okay. You know what's coming to mind with that? is the Twilight movies. Okay, so Team Edward, Team Jacob. We did a vampire one for last week's episode, and so Jacob was a werewolf, right? And he was a pack, because wolves, while they can also be lone wolves or singular, they typically will run in packs, especially to hunt. And so that's something that we tend to think there's usually more than one of them, right? It's not typically, oh, it's a singular werewolf, although sometimes it can be. In medieval Europe, during the Middle Ages, the werewolf myth was reinforced by fears of actual wolf attacks and superstitions surrounding witchcraft and curses, leading to witch trials and the persecution of accused werewolves. So not only were there witch trials, right, where they were burned at the stake and all these things, all these horrible things, there were apparently werewolf questioning suspicions. So I assume multiple people were actually thought to be werewolves and actually harmed or killed. Clinical lycanthropy, say that 5 times fast, misunderstandings of mental health conditions like clinical lycanthropy, where a person believes that they are transforming into an animal, may have also influenced the development of werewolf folklore. The modern werewolf. The modern understanding of the werewolf as a human who painfully transforms into a wolf-like creature, often uncontrollably, developed significantly in the 20th century through the influence of cinema. Okay, so in modern times, the werewolf is seen as a wolf, human-like creature, either purposefully or after being placed under a curse or affliction, often a bite or the occasional scratch from another werewolf, with the transformations occurring on the night of a full moon. Early sources for belief in this ability or affliction, called lycanthropy, are dating back to 1150 or 1228. The werewolf is a widespread concept in European folklore, existing in many variants, which are related by a common development of a Christian interpretation of underlying European folklore, developed during the Middle Ages. From the early modern period, werewolf beliefs spread to the Western Hemisphere with colonialism. Belief in werewolves developed in parallel to the belief in witches during the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. Like the witchcraft trials as a whole, the trial of supposed werewolves emerged in what is now Switzerland, especially in Valais and Vaud in the early 15th century, and spread through Europe in the 16th century, peaking in the 17th and subsiding by the 18th century. So from the 15th to the 17th centuries is when that peaked, and by the 18th century it had stopped. The persecution of werewolves and the associated folklore is an integral part of the witch hunt phenomenon, albeit a marginal one, with accusations of lycanthropy being involved in only a small fraction of witchcraft trials. During the early period, accusations of lycanthropy, transforming into a wolf, were mixed with accusations of wolf riding or wolf charming. The case of Peter Stump in 1589 led to a significant peak in both interest in and persecution of supposed werewolves. Primarily in French-speaking and German-speaking Europe, the phenomenon persisted the longest in Bavaria and Austria, with the persecution of wolf charmers recorded until well after 1650. The final cases taking place in the early 18th century in Carnithia and Styria. Interesting. After the end of the witch trials, the werewolf became of interest in folklore studies and in the merging of Gothic horror genre. Werewolf fiction as a genre has pre-modern precedents in medieval romances. And developed in the 18th century out of the semi-fictional chapbook tradition. The trappings of horror literature in the 20th century became part of the horror and fantasy genre of modern popular culture. Now, if I remember right, there's been several TV series and shows and movies that have to do with werewolves. Teen Wolf comes to mind. I want to say that was Jason Bateman way back when. I think there were movies about it. You know, we've had like the Twilight stuff with wolves in it. We had the other one that I mentioned at the beginning with Kate Beckinsale. I can't remember the male's actor's name that was in that was the werewolf, but there's been several of them to my knowledge over the years. In modern English, werewolf descends from the Old English werewolf, which is of Middle Dutch descent. Let's see. The Norse branch underwent taboo modifications. Let's see. Replacing certain names for man with wolf or outlaw. Under the influence of the old French expression, Loups Waros. Let's see. It literally translates to wolf or werewolf. So let's see. So many different dialects, many different names, many different languages, all deriving from different parts of the world. We have Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Old Norse, Middle German, Germanic, Frankish, Norman. So lots and lots of different words for the same thing, werewolf. Okay, so let's see. We had some Slavic, Slovenian, Romanian, Greek. Lots and lots and lots of them. Bulgarian. Let's see, where else? Old Brittonic. I don't even know if I've ever heard of that. Welsh, Breton. All had different variations of the wolfman or werewolves. Interesting. Okay, so let's get into the history. So Indo-European comparative mythology, the European motif of the devilish werewolf devouring human flesh harks back to a common development during the Middle Ages. In the context of Christianity, although stories of humans turning into wolves take their roots in earlier pre-Christian beliefs, their underlying common origin can be traced back to Proto-Indo-European mythology, where lycanthropy is reconstructed as an aspect of the initiation of the Kourios warrior class, which may have included a cult focused on dogs and wolves, identified with an age grade of young unmarried warriors. The standard comparative overview of this aspect of Indo-European mythology is Miss Cohn's 1987 work. Classical Antiquity. A few references to men changing into wolves are found in ancient Greek literature and Greek mythology. Herodotus and his histories wrote that according to what the Scythians and the Greeks settled in Scythia told him that Nuri, a tribe of the northeast Scythia, were all transformed into wolves once every year for several days and then changed back into their human shape. Now we see that part depicted in several of the movie depictions, right? Especially Twilight comes to mind. So Jacob and his tribe, his other group of werewolves, under the full moon would shapeshift, right? They would turn from their human form into their werewolf form, and they would go on a hunt together, typically feeding on people or animals. And then after a few days, all of a sudden they would shapeshift again and they would turn back into their human form. Now, typically they say that this would occur after the initial scratch or bite, right? They had to be inflicted with the DNA basically of the original werewolf or the werewolf that turned them. And then it could last, a week or so, and then they would shapeshift back into their human form. So it's interesting how many of these things carried on through generations, I think, anyway. Let's see. In the 2nd century BC, the Greek geographer Pausanias related the story of King Lycon of Arcadia, who was transformed into a wolf because he had sacrificed a child on the altar of Zeus Lycaeus. In the version of this legend told by Ovid, when Zeus visits Lycon disguised as a commoner, Lycon wants to test to see if he is really a god. To that end, he kills a Molossan, a hostage, and serves his entrails to Zeus. Disgusted, the god turns Lycaon into a wolf. However, in other accounts of the legend, like that of Pseudo-Apollodorus, Zeus blasts him and his sons with thunderbolts as punishment. So apparently there's variations of that as well. Let's see. There's another story of an Arcadian man called Demarchus, who was turned into a wolf after tasting the entrails of a human child sacrificed to Zeus. He was restored to human form 10 years later and became an Olympic champion. This tale is also recounted by Pliny the Elder, who calls the man Demenantius Areopagus. According to the first account, this was not a one-off event, for men have been transformed into wolves during sacrifices to Zeus since the time of Lycon. If they abstain from tasting human flesh while wolves, they will be restored to human form 9 years later. If they do not abstain, they will remain wolves forever. I feel like that's a key part in this. So it's almost like a test of their willpower, right? So they're in this altered state, they're in this animalistic urge, right? And if they can resist the urge to consume human flesh during that time, they will eventually be restored 9 years later. But if they consume the human flesh, then they stay a werewolf forever. And I think that's where a lot of this actually comes from. All right. So Lycos of Athens was a wolf-shaped hero whose shrine stood by the jury court, and the first jurors were named after him. Interesting. Okay, let's see. What else do we want to include? Because there is so much information to include in some of these. So there's lots of different accounts from all over the world, but it looks like predominantly in Europe that there is most of these older accounts. So let's see. Okay. Early Christian authors also mentioned werewolves. In The City of God, Augustine of Hippo gives an account similar to that found in Pliny the Elder's Natural History. Augustine explains that it is very generally believed that by certain witches' spells, men may be turned into wolves. So basically blaming witches again, right? And they blamed them for everything. Physical metamorphosis was also mentioned in the Capitulum Escapi, attributed to the Synod of Arcania in the 4th century, which has become the early Christian church's doctrinal text in relation to magic, witches, and transformations such as those of werewolves. This book states that whoever believes that anything can be transformed into another species or likeness except by God himself is beyond doubt an infidel. Okay. In the works of the early Roman Church or Christian writers, werewolves often received the name turnskin. Instead, used the phrase changed into the form of a wolf to describe the metamorphosis of werewolves, which is similar to phrases used in the medieval period. I cannot pronounce the Greek it's too much of a tongue twister. I'm just going to mutilate it. So, turned skin and changed into the form of a wolf. So, describing their metamorphosis, which we know would have happened periodically, probably monthly, I would think, because every month we have a full moon. And so they would be feeding during that time, just like the vampires. There is evidence of widespread belief in werewolves in medieval Europe, spanning across the European continent and the British Isles. Werewolves were mentioned in medieval law codes, such as that of Nut the Great, who aimed to ensure that the madly audacious werewolf does not too widely devastate nor bite too many of the spiritual flock. There were rumors that flew of a son of Simeon of Bulgaria, that he could use magic to turn himself into a wolf. That's interesting. The works of Augustine of Hippo had a large influence on the development of Western Christianity, being read widely by Christian clergy of the medieval period. The clergymen occasionally discussed werewolves in their works, including Gerald of Wells' Werewolf of Ossory. Okay, let's see. They were both written for royal audiences. So there's another one, Gervase of Tilbury and Otia Imperalia. They were written for royal audiences. So they were written for kings and queens to consume. Okay, let's see. What else shall we include? So further evidence of the widespread belief in werewolves and other human-to-animal transformations can be seen in theological attacks made against such beliefs. Let's see, there was writing in the 11th century that forbid reading stories in which a person's reasoning is obscured following such a transformation. Conrad specifically refers to the tales of Ovid in his tract. Writing in the 12th century follows Augustine of Hippo's argument that no physical transformation can be made by any but God, stating that the body cannot be changed into the material limbs of any animal. Interesting. Okay. So another example of nobleman Bisclavrat, for reasons not described, had to transform into a wolf every week. That sounds painful. When his treacherous wife stole his clothing, needed to restore his human form, he escaped the king's wolf hunt by imploring the king for mercy, accompanying the king thereafter. His behavior at court was gentle until his wife and her new husband appeared one day, so much so that his hateful attack on the couple was deemed justly motivated, and the truth was revealed. So this other man, this nobleman, Bisclavrat, transformed every single week into a werewolf, because his treacherous wife stole his clothing that he needed to restore him into human form. He escaped the king's wolf hunt by begging for mercy for the king, and then he accompanied him everywhere after that. But the wife and the new husband appeared in the court one day, and so he had a hateful attack that was deemed justly, and so they concealed that until that day. Okay. Very interesting. The lie follows many themes found within other werewolf tales. The removal of clothing and attempted to refrain from the consumption of human flesh can be found in Pliny the Elder, as well as Gervase of Tilbury's werewolf story about a werewolf named Chalvier. I'm terrible at names, apologies. Marie de France also revealed the continued existence of werewolf-related beliefs in Brittany and Normandy in using the Norman Guard, Garwolf, which she explained are common in that part of France. Many men turned into werewolves. Gervais supports this terminology when relating that the French used the term girlfree to describe what the English called werewolves. Let's see. There are two anonymous stories that share the theme of a werewolf knight being betrayed by his wife. It's strange how so many of them correlate to like the same starting point, the same origin. And that's really what I was trying to find with all of these folklore stories, is I wanted to see like, where do the roots, where do the origins of these stories actually come from? Are there a lot of things that we can document in history that really do depict that these things came from a certain origin, you know, and is there truth or validity to these claims? Because I feel like for some of them there really are. All right, so the German word werewolf was recorded in the 11th century and in the 13th century, but was not used frequently in medieval German poetry or fiction. There we go. While certain people argue that references to werewolves were rare in England, presumably because whatever significance the wolfmen of that time had carried, their associated beliefs and practices had been successfully repressed by the Christianization. If they persisted, he writes, they did so outside of the sphere of evidence available. Other examples of werewolf mythology in Ireland and the British Isles can be found in the work of the 9th century Welsh monk Nennius. Female werewolves appear in the Irish work Tales of the Elders from the 12th century, and Welsh werewolves are noted in the 12th and 13th century work of Mabinogion. Okay. All right, so there's also German pagan traditions associated with wolfmen, persisted longest in the Scandinavian Viking Age. It's funny to me how we have Vikings mixed with werewolves, right? It's like, that must have been such a wild time to be alive, right? There's famine, there's destruction, there's the Crusades going on, there's, you know, people fighting for every scrap of anything that they had in life. Hygiene is poor, water is poor, like there's so much going on. And then we throw in Vikings and werewolves on top of it. How crazy. All right, so let's see. There was one called the Berserkers. So the Ulfner were similar to the Berserkers, but dressed in wolf rather than bear hides, and were reputed to channel the spirits of the animals they wore to enhance effectiveness in battle. Okay, now that makes sense, because I feel like there's probably like movies and things that I've seen, like Ragnar, who was head of the Vikings once upon a time, and I can remember he had like bear pelts that he would wear, but I think some of them maybe had like wolves, because I can remember seeing like the head sitting on top of them. And so this is saying that it would have caused them to kind of like channel the animals' spirits in order to enhance their effectiveness in battle. That's kind of interesting. So the Ulfner were resistant to pain and vicious in battle, much like wild animals. The Ulfner and Berserker are closely associated with the Norse god Odin. How cool is that? The Scandinavian story traditions of the Viking Age may have spread to Kelvin Rus, giving rise to the Slavic werewolf tales. The 11th century Belarusian prince Vlad of Poltis was recounted in the tale of Igor's campaign to have been a werewolf capable of moving at superhuman speed. And I do remember in some of those movies, it's like they have these natural abilities not only to shapeshift, but also like they can jump incredibly high, they can run super fast. And if I remember right, in Twilight, it depicts that with Jacob, that he could just like in a flash be in one area to the next. So definitely some things to think about there. All right, let's see what else. So apparently being a werewolf was a common accusation in witch trials. It featured in the Velasquez witch trials, one of the earliest such trials in the first half of the 15th century. In 1539, Martin Luther used the form beer wolf to describe a hypothetical ruler worse than a tyrant who must be resisted. And I remember hearing about Martin Luther. We're talking about Martin Luther, who was part of the reformation of the Christian church, not Martin Luther King Jr. Very different people. Okay, let's see. In 1555, Olaus Magnus describes an annual assembly of werewolves near the Lithuania-Courland border. The participants, including Lithuanian nobility, were werewolves from the surrounding areas. They gathered to test their strength by attempting to jump over a castle's walls ruins. Those who succeed are regarded as strong, while weaker participants are punished with whippings. Early modern history of werewolves. There are numerous reports of werewolf attacks and consequent court trials in the 16th century in France. In some of the cases, there was clear evidence against the accused of murder and cannibalism, but no association with wolves. In other cases, people have been terrified by such creatures, such as that of Giles Garner in Dole in 1573, who was convicted of being a werewolf. You gotta wonder, what in the world, first of all, besides, murderous things going on or cannibalism going on, what in the world evidence would they have to try or convict somebody of that? Very interesting. Lycanthropy received peak attention in the late 16th and early 17th century as part of the European witch hunts. A number of treatises on werewolves were written in France during 1595 and 1615. In 1598, werewolves were cited as Anjou. In 1602, Henry Boget wrote a lengthy chapter about werewolves. And in 1603, a teenage werewolf was sentenced to life imprisonment in Bordeaux. So maybe that's where Teen Wolf came from, right? Because there was a teenager who supposedly was a werewolf who was sentenced to life in prison in Bordeaux, France. Okay. In the Swiss region, werewolves were convicted in 1602 and 1624. By a pastor in 1653. However, argued that lycanthropy was purely an illusion. After this, the only further record from the Vaud dates to 1670. A boy claimed that he and his mother could change into wolves, which was not taken seriously. At the beginning of the 17th century, witchcraft was prosecuted by James I of England, who regarded werewolfies, werewolfes, werewolfies, as victims of delusion induced by a natural superabundance of melancholic. So they thought it was a delusion. After 1650, belief in lycanthropy had mostly disappeared from French-speaking Europe, as evidence in Diderot's encyclopedia, which attributed reports of lycanthropy to a disorder of the brain or mental illness. Although there were continuing reports of extraordinary wolf-like beasts, they were not considered to be werewolves. One such report concerned the beast of Gavon, which terrorized the general area and former province of Gavon, now called Lozerie, in south-central France. From 1764 to 1767, it killed upwards of 80 men, women, and children. Wow, okay. The part of Europe which showed more vigorous interest in werewolves after 1650 was the Holy Roman Empire. At least 9 works on lycanthropy were printed in Germany between 1649 and 1679 in the Austrian and Bavarian Alps. Belief in werewolves persisted well into the 18th century. As late as 1853, in Galicia, northwestern Spain, Manuel Blanco Romsanta was judged and condemned as the author of a number of murders, but he claimed to be not guilty because of his condition being a werewolf. So that's only a couple hundred years ago, 1853. So he claimed to not be guilty of all of these murders because he was a werewolf. Until the 20th century, wolf attacks were an occasional but still widespread feature for life in Europe. Some scholars have suggested that it was inevitable that wolves, being the most feared predators in Europe, were projected into the folklore of evil shapeshifters. It is said to be corroborated by the fact that areas devoid of wolves typically use different kinds of predators to fill the niche. Let's see, were hyenas in Africa, were tigers in India, as well as were pumas and were jaguars and tiger capiango in southern South America. An idea explored in the book of Werewolves is that werewolf legends may have been used to explain serial killings. Okay, so that's kind of what I thought this was going to go to, is that, you know, it's really easy to just blame it on a made-up entity, right? Oh, it's not a human that's doing it, it's an animal, right? So then who stands trial for all of these people that disappeared or have been murdered? Nobody, right? Just the werewolves. So let's see, perhaps the most infamous example of this is the case of Peter Stump, executed in 1589, the German farmer and alleged serial killer and cannibal, also known as the Werewolf of Bedburg. Interesting. Okay, so we also have Asian cultures that believed in werewolf. So Turkic folklore holds a different reverential light to the werewolf's legend in the Turkic Central Asian shamans. After performing long and arduous rites, they would voluntarily be able to transform into the humanoid Kurtadam, literally meaning wolfman, since the wolf was the totemic ancestor animal of the Turkic peoples. They would respect any shaman in such a form. And that also reminds me, like I was saying earlier, Native American culture believed in shape-shifting, and especially like animal skins, because what comes to mind is seeing a skinwalker, I think is what they're actually called, where it's humanoid, but it's also cloaked in like animal fur. So they were able to shapeshift from human to animal in many different forms, if I can remember the legend correctly. So some modern researchers have tried to explain the reports of werewolf behavior with recognized medical conditions. In 1963, Dr. Lee Illis of Guy's Hospital in London wrote a paper entitled On Porphyria and the Atology of Werewolves, in which he argues that historical accounts on werewolves could have been referring to victims of congenital porphyria, stating how the symptoms of photosensitivity, reddish teeth, and psychosis could have been grounds for accusing a person of being a werewolf. This is argued against by Woodward, who points out how mythological werewolves were almost invariably portrayed as resembling true wolves, and that their human forms were rarely physically conspicuous as the porphyria victims. Others have pointed out the possibility of historical werewolves having been people with hypertrichosis, a hereditary condition manifesting itself in excessive hair growth. Woodward dismissed the possibility as the rarity of the disease ruled it out from happening on a large scale, as werewolf cases were in the medieval Europe. Now, my background is in hair, and so hypertrichosis is something we actually learned about, right? So we have a background in anatomy and certain diseases that are predominant in hair, skin, and nails, because that was our scope of expertise. And so hypertrichosis is something that's pretty relatively rare, but we do see it in certain areas of the world. South America is one of the ones that comes to mind, and they're born this way, where they have an excessive amount of hair on like the backs of their shoulders, down their arms, and sometimes their entire face. So not just like a beard that we would normally see. Sometimes they actually have hair all around their face, and they look very furry, almost animal-like. And there's literally nothing that can be done. It's just how their body grows hair. And so they would look like a werewolf because their faces grow hair completely around it. So almost if you look at like a wolf or a dog, how they have fur all around their face, these human beings would have that. It's a birth defect, basically. So let's see, Woodward suggested that rabies could have been the origin of werewolf beliefs, claiming remarkable similarities between the symptoms of that disease and some of the legends. Woodward focused on the idea that being bitten by a werewolf could result in the victim turning into one, which suggests that the idea of the transmittable disease like rabies. However, the idea that lycanthropy could be transmitted in this way was not part of the original myths and legends, and only appears in relatively recent beliefs. Lycanthropy can also be met with as the main content of a delusion. For example, the case of a woman has been reported who during episodes of acute psychosis complained of becoming 4 different species of animals. So what do you think? Do you think that it is a period of psychosis and mental illness? Do you think that there is any sort of fact or truth to people being a werewolf? So let's get into some characteristics. The beliefs classed together under lycanthropy are far from uniform, and the term is somewhat loosely applied. There we go. The transformation may be temporary or permanent. The were animal may be the human themselves metamorphized, and may be their double who actively leaves the real human to all appearance unchanged. It may be their soul, which goes forth seeking whomever it may want to devour, leaving its body in a state of trance, or it may be no more than the messenger of the human being, a real animal or a familiar spirit whose intimate connection with its owner is shown by the fact that any injury to it is believed by a phenomenon known as repercussion to cause a corresponding injury to the human being. So the long and the short of that is, they think that it could be a familiar spirit. It could also be that if the animal, while it's in the animal form, is injured in any way, that transfers to the human being. So let's say while it's in its werewolf form, that it's attacked by people, right? Maybe they're way back when throwing spears at it or fire to try and burn it, whatever. And so as it shapeshifts back into the human form, that human may have burns, or that human might have injuries or scars. Very interesting. Werewolves were said in Europe, to bear physical telltale traits even in their human form. These included the meeting of both eyebrows at the bridge of the nose. Okay, so a unibrow right here, where instead of there being a separation, they were joined together. Okay, so that was one of them. The meeting of both eyebrows, curved fingernails, low-set ears, and a swinging stride. If you've ever watched wolves, they almost kind of like float as they run. So their gait is very smooth as they kind of run through the forest. Okay, one method of identifying a werewolf in its human form was to cut the flesh of the accused, under the pretense that the fur would be seen within the wound. A Russian superstition recalls a werewolf can be recognized by bristles under the tongue. Interesting. So they're talking about if there is a cut, that you would see fur in the wound. if it was truly a werewolf. So they would make a cut and that you would see fur or hair in the wound. And then the Russian superstition is saying that a werewolf could be recognized by bristles under the tongue. So there would be something underneath there. The appearance of a werewolf in its animal form varies from culture to culture. It is most commonly portrayed as being indistinguishable from ordinary wolves. So it would blend in to a pack of wolves, except for the fact that it has no tail. So wolves typically do have a big fluffy tail. That's a pretty common characteristic. And so obviously if it was a human, it wouldn't have a tail, right? Humans don't have tails. So that's interesting. I didn't know that either. Let's see. Okay, so it had no tail. A trait thought characteristics of witches in animal form. It's often larger and retains human eyes and a voice. According to some Swedish accounts, the werewolf could be distinguished from a regular wolf by the fact that it would run on 3 legs, stretching the 4th one backwards to look like a tail. How funny is that? After returning to their human forms, werewolves are usually documented as becoming weak, debilitated, and undergoing painful nervous depression. One universally rivaled trait in medieval Europe was that werewolves' habit of devouring recently buried corpses, a trait that is documented extensively, particularly in the Annales Medico-Psychologicalis in the 19th century. So it's documented in certain books in the 19th century. So becoming a werewolf. Various methods for becoming a werewolf have been reported, with one of the simplest being the removal of clothing and putting on a belt made of wolfskin, probably as a substitute for the assumption of an entire animal skin, which also is frequently described. In other cases, the body is rubbed with a magic salve. In the 16th century, Swedish writer Olaus Magnus says that the Livonian werewolves were initiated by draining a cup of specially prepared beer and repeating a set formula. Ralston, in his Songs of the Russian Peoples, gives the form of incantation still familiar in Russia. In Italy, France, and Germany, it was said that a man or a woman could turn into a werewolf if he or she, on a certain Wednesday or Friday, slept outside on a summer night with the full moon shining directly on his or her face. In other cases, the transformation was supposedly accomplished by satanic allegiance for the most loathsome ends, often for the sake of sating a craving for human flesh. The werewolves, writes Richard Verstegan in the Restitution of Decayed Intelligence in 1628. Let's see. The phenomenon of repercussion, the power of animal metamorphosis, or of sending out a familiar, real or spiritual, as a messenger, and the supernormal powers conferred by association with such a familiar are also attributed to the magician, male and female, all the world over, and which superstitions are closely parallel to, if not identical with, lycanthropic beliefs. The association and occasional involuntary character of lycanthropy being almost the sole distinguishing feature. In another direction, the repercussion is asserted to manifest itself in connection with the bush soul of the West African and Central America. Although there is no line of demarcation to be drawn on logical grounds, the assumed power of the magician and the intimate association of the bush soul or the nagal with a human being are not termed lycanthropy. So in various parts around the world, there are these legends, this folklore of the lichen, of the werewolf. Some of it said to be spells, some of it said to be witchcraft, things like that. Maybe some of it was from the old gods that were turning people into these entities. Some of it is said to be psychosis. So there's many different things in order for these werewolves to be a thing. All right. The power of transforming others into wild beasts was attributed not only to malignant sorcerers, but to Christian saints as well. Let's see. Angels, good and bad, have the power of transmuting our bodies, was the dictum of Thomas Aquinas. St. Patrick was said to have transformed the Welsh king Verticus into a wolf, supposedly cursed an illustrious Irish family whose members were each doomed to be a wolf for 7 years. In other tales, the divine agency is even more direct, while in Russia, again, men supposedly became werewolves when incurring the wrath of the devil. There's just so many of these. I could go on and on and on forever and ever. So let's see, what are some supposed remedies for the poor werewolves? Various methods have existed for removing the werewolf form. In antiquity, the ancient Greeks and Romans believed that in the power of exhaustion in curing people of lycanthropy. Exhaustion, okay? The victim would be subjected to long periods of physical activity in the hope of being purged of the malady. This practice stemmed from the fact that many alleged werewolves would be left feeling weak and debilitated after committing depredations, murders basically. They were hunting. In medieval Europe, traditionally, there are 3 methods one can use to cure a victim of lycanthropy. Medicinally, usually via the use of wolfsbane, surgically, or by exorcism. Many of the cures advocated by medieval medical practitioners proved fatal to the patients. A Sicilian belief of Arabic origins holds that a werewolf can be cured of its ailment by striking it on the forehead or scalp with a knife. Another belief from the same culture involves the piercing of the werewolf's hands with nails. Sometimes less extreme methods were used. In the German lowlands of Schleswig-Holstein, a werewolf could be cured if one were to simply address it 3 times by its Christian name. One Danish belief holds that merely scolding a werewolf will cure it. You naughty little werewolf, knock it off. And conversion to Christianity was a common method of removing lycanthropy in the medieval period. So we're going to have Christian werewolves. Okay. A devotion to Saint Hubert has been cited as both cure for and protection from lycanthropes. Connection to the Revenant. Okay, I want to say that's the name of a movie that doesn't have anything to do with werewolves. The Revenant, I want to say, what is his darn name? Leo DiCaprio, I want to say, is in that movie, and it has nothing to do with werewolves. So before the end of the 19th century, the Greeks believed that corpses of werewolves, if not destroyed, would return to life in the form of wolves or hyenas that prowled battlefields, drinking the blood of dying soldiers. In the same vein, in some rural areas of Germany, Poland, and northern France, it was once believed that people who died in mortal sin came back to life as blood-drinking wolves. These undead werewolves would return to their human corpses' form at daylight. They were dealt with by decapitation with a spade and exorcism by the parish priest. The head would then be thrown into a stream where the weight of its sins was thought to weigh it down. Sometimes the same methods used to dispose of ordinary vampires would be used. The vampire was linked to the werewolf in East European countries, particularly Bulgaria, Serbia, and Slovenia. In Serbia, the werewolf and the vampire are known collectively as Volkodlak. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. The Hungary and Balkans. In Hungarian folklore, werewolves are said to live in the region of Transdanubia, and it was thought that the ability to change into a wolf was obtained in infancy after suffering parental abuse or by a curse. It is told that at the age of 7, the boy or the girl leave home at night to go hunting and can change to a person or wolf whenever they want. The curse can also be obtained in adulthood if a person passes 3 times through an arch made of birch with the help of a wild rose's spine. The werewolves were known to exterminate all kinds of farm animals, especially sheep. The transformation usually occurred during the winter solstice, Easter, and a full moon. Later in the 17th and 18th century, the trials in Hungary were not only conducted against witches, but against werewolves too, and many records exist documenting connections between the two. Vampires and werewolves are closely related in Hungarian folklore, both being feared in antiquity. Again, the movie with Kate Beckinsale, and I don't know why I can't think of the name of it, but they correlate, right? The werewolf and the vampires. And it's like there's these clans and they fight and they go to war and they try and separate. And then, you know, she falls in love with the opposite that she's not supposed to. So it's a good movie. I just can't remember the name of it. Okay. Among the South Slavs and among the ethnic Kushabian people in present-day northern Poland, there was the belief that if a child was born with hair, a birthmark, or a caul on their head, they were supposed to possess shape-shifting abilities. Though capable of turning into any animal they wished, it was commonly believed that such people preferred to turn into a wolf. How interesting. Okay, Serbian Volkoldlaks traditionally had the habit of congregating annually in the winter months when they would strip off their wolf skins and hang them from trees. They would then get a hold of another Volkoldlaks skin and burn it, releasing from its curse the werewolf from whom the skin came. So they would have like these rituals where they would burn the skin of one so that they would be set free from their curse. Okay, according to Armenian lore, there are women who, in consequences of deadly sins, are condemned to spend 7 years in wolf form. So we have some that it's 7 years, some that it's 9 years. It's interesting how that part changes in different areas. In a typical account, a condemned woman is visited by a wolf skin toting spirit who orders her to wear the skin, which causes her to acquire frightful cravings for human flesh soon after. With her better nature overcome, the she-wolf devours each of her own children, then her relatives' children in order of relationship, and finally the children of strangers. She wanders only at night, with doors and locks springing open at her approach. When morning arrives, she reverts to human form and removes her wolf skin. The transformation is generally said to be involuntary, and there are alternative versions involving voluntary metamorphosis where the woman can transform at will. In the Americas and the Caribbean, this is about skinwalkers. So again, just like the Native American cultures, I feel like we have a lot of different ones that would fall into the skinwalkers. The Naskapis believed that the caribou afterlife is guarded by giant wolves that kill careless hunters venturing too near. The Navajo people feared witches in wolves' clothing called macabre. Woodward thought that these beliefs were due to the Norse colonization of the Americas. When the European colonization of the Americas occurred, the pioneers brought their own werewolf folklore with them and were later influenced by the lore of their neighboring colonies and those of the natives. Belief in the Loup Garou presents in Canada, the upper and lower peninsulas of Michigan, and upstate New York originates from French folklore influenced by Native American stories of the Wendigo. If you guys have ever seen the show Supernatural, it talks about so many of these. The Wendigo, werewolves, lichen, vampires, right? Like they're featured in so many of the episodes. In Mexico, there is a belief in a creature called the Nagal. In Haiti, there is a superstition that werewolf spirits known locally as Jeru, red eyes, can possess the bodies of unwitting persons and nightly transforms them into cannibalistic, lupine creatures. The Haitian Jerus typically try to trick mothers into giving away their children voluntarily by waking them at night and asking their permission to take their child, to which the disoriented mother may either reply yes or no. The Haitian differ from traditional European werewolves by their habit of actively trying to spread their lichen conditions to others, much like vampires, right? So they would want to make more of them, same with vampires, right? They create lots of them. They create their own clan, basically, of more vampires, and the same is thought of the werewolves, that they go out and they bite people and turn more people into werewolves. So let's see, werewolf fiction, let's get some of that. Most modern fiction describes werewolves as vulnerable to silver weapons and highly resistant to other injuries. This feature appears in German folklore of the 19th century. The claim that the beast of Javad, an 18th century wolf or wolf-like creature, was shot by a silver bullet appears to have been introduced by novelists retelling the story from 1935 onwards, and not in earlier versions. So, it's like the game of telephone. People retell a story and they change the details, right? Just to make it more spicy, more appealing. English folklore prior to 1865 showed shapeshifters to be vulnerable to silver. In 1640, the city of Greifswald, Germany, was infested by werewolves. A clever lad suggested that they gather all of their silver buttons, goblets, belt buckles, and so forth, and melt them down into bullets for their muskets and pistols. This time, they slaughtered the creatures and rid Greifswald of the lycanthropes. In 1897, the novel Dracula and the short story Dracula's Guest, both written by Bram Stoker, drew on earlier mythologies of werewolves and similar legendary demons and was a voice to the anxieties of the age. Let's see. In Dracula's Guest, a band of military horsemen coming to the aid of the protagonist chase off Dracula, depicted as a great wolf stating the only way to kill it is by a sacred bullet. This is also mentioned in the main novel Dracula as well. Count Dracula stated in the novel that legends of werewolves originated from his Zekli racial bloodline, who himself is also depicted with the ability to shapeshift into a wolf at will during the night, but is unable to do so during the day except at noon. Okay, so that one says that in the novel Count Dracula that he was able to shapeshift because of his racial bloodline into a wolf at will during the night, but is unable to do so during the day except at noon. How bizarre is that? In 1928, the novel The Wolf's Bride, A Tale from Estonia, written by the Finnish author Aina Kallis, tells the story of Forrester Prydik's wife, Allo, living in Humia in the 17th century, who became a werewolf under the influence of a malevolent forest spirit, also known as Diblos slivarium. The first feature film to use anthropomorphic werewolf was Werewolf in London in 1935. The main werewolf of this film is a dapper London scientist who retains some of his style and most of his human features after his transformation. The lead actor, Henry Hull, was unwilling to spend long hours being made up by makeup artist Jack Pierce. Universal Studios drew on a Balkan tale of a plant associated with lycanthropy, as there was no literary work to draw upon, unlike the case with vampires. There is no reference to silver, nor to other aspects of werewolf lore, such as cannibalism. Isn't that interesting? So all these things that we associate with this, there's not a lot of things up until that point in the 1930s to support that. A more tragic character is Lawrence Talbot, played by Lon Chaney Jr. in 1941's The Wolfman. With Pierce's makeup more elaborate this time, the movie catapulted the werewolf into public consciousness. Sympathetic portrayals are few but notable, such as the comedic but tortured protagonist David Naughton in An American Werewolf in London, and a less anguished and more confident and charismatic Jack Nicholson in 1994's film Wolf. Over time, the depiction of werewolves has gone from fully malevolent or even heroic creatures, such as in The Underworld — that was the one I couldn't think of with Kate Beckinsale — the Underworld series and Twilight series, as well as Bloodlad, Dance in the Vampire Bund, Rosario and Vampire, and various other movies, anime, manga, and comic books. Other werewolves are decidedly more willful and malevolent, such as those in the novel The Howling and its subsequent sequels and film adaptations. The form a werewolf assumes is generally anthropomorphic in early films such as The Wolfman and Werewolf in London, but larger and more powerful wolf in many later films. So they have adapted it for Hollywood, of course, over the years. Let's see. Werewolves are often depicted as immune to damage caused by ordinary weapons, being vulnerable only to silver objects, such as a silver-tipped cane, bullet, or blade. This attribute was first adopted cinematically in The Wolfman. This negative reaction to silver is sometimes so strong that the mere touch of the metal on a werewolf's skin will cause burns. Current-day werewolf fiction almost exclusively involves lycanthropy being either a hereditary condition or transmitted like an infectious disease by the bite of another werewolf. In some fiction, the power of the werewolf extends to human forms, such as invulnerability to conventional injury due to their healing factor, superhuman speed and strength, and falling on their feet from high falls. Aggressiveness and animalistic urges may be intensified and more difficult to control, such as hunger and sexual arousal. Usually in these cases, the abilities are diminished in human form. In other fiction, it can be cured by medicine men or antidotes. Along with the vulnerability to the silver bullet, the full moon being the cause of the transformation only became part of the depiction of werewolves on a widespread basis in the 20th century. The first movie to feature the transformative effect of the full moon was Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman in 1943. Werewolves are typically envisioned as working-class monsters, often being low in socioeconomic status, although they can represent a variety of social classes and at times were seen as a way of representing aristocrat decadence during the 19th century horror literature. In Nazi Germany, used werewolf as the mythical creature's name is spelled in In Nazi Germany, they used the word werewolf, W-E-R-W-O-L-F, as the mythical creature's name. It is spelled that way in German language. In 1942 and 43, as the code name for one of Hitler's headquarters. In the war's final days, the Nazi Operation Werewolf aimed at creating a commando force that would operate behind enemy lines as the Allies advanced through Germany itself. Two fictional depictions, there we go, mouth, come on, work with me here, of Operation Werewolf, the U.S. television series True Blood, and the 2012 novel Wolf Hunter by J.L. Benet mixed the two meanings of werewolf and depicting the 1945 die-hard Nazi commandos, part of Operation Werewolf, as being actual werewolves. Wow, say that 5 times fast. So what do you think? Do you think werewolves are real? Do you think they existed? Do you think that there's still some ancient bloodlines that continue on today? I would love to know your comments. Please leave one down below. Have a wonderful week. We'll see you next time.